I am really excited. We are doing this a little bit different this year. We have our unofficial start. So I know everybody's here, but we're not really starting. We don't start till tomorrow. So this isn't really happening. Anybody who shows up tomorrow, this didn't happen. They didn't get to know about it. So this is our little secret. Although we are going to be live streaming, and if anybody, you want to text someone who did not be able to make it, please have them go to the SADOD Facebook page, because this will be live streamed, and they can certainly join us at there. So if anybody wants to jump on their text and say, hey, I know you couldn't make it tonight, but if you want to hear what's going on, they're more than welcome to. So it will be live streamed. This will be the only kind of part of the conference that will be live streamed. It's an experiment. If it goes well, we may have more live streaming next year. But for this year, this is our store one event. So I wanted to go ahead and take a moment and introduce our speaker for this evening. This seems to fade in and out. I'm not sure. Is it?
It's not just you. No. It's not just you now.
So it's me. I was told it was supposed to eat an ice cream cone. Is what I was supposed to do, but I feel like I'm not going to lick this thing. So I have to figure out how to eat an ice cream cone without going that far. So anyway, thank you. So I want to introduce you to Litsa Williams. Litsa and I met, we were just talking a moment ago. I can't remember, but it was probably about a decade ago we met. And Litsa runs one of the largest, if not the largest, on-site, online grief organizations, What's Your Grief? So some of you may or may not have been there. If you have not, I highly recommend it. It is full of amazing resources, and many of them are written by Litsa, as well as her partner. Litsa is a professional in the grief world. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she's been a grief therapist for 15 years. But that's not why she's here today. Good question. Good question. Why is she here? I put that, I didn't mean, but okay, yeah, the obvious question is, why is she here? She's here as a peer. She's here as a peer. Her brother-in-law, John, died from substance-related causes, and her sister, Anne-Marie, struggles with substance use. And so she is very familiar with the professional side of all of this, but she's also very familiar with the peer side of it. So with that, I'd like to bring forward Litsa Williams.
All right, and I don't know what time it is, so let me, okay, I'm really bad at time. This is dangerous without something to look at. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I would glad to reach out about this. I was so excited to come up, and I think one of the things that you may not know if you live here in this area is just how uniquely incredible the amount of support is for substance-related death. And I'll tell you a little bit more about me as we get into what we're talking about this evening. But I am based in Baltimore. I'm born and raised from Baltimore. But with What's Your Grief, I work with organizations and areas all over the country. And it really gives this unique insight into being able to kind of see what happens in all different areas. And because thinking about overdose, thinking about substance-related death is something that impacts me directly, that has been part of my personal and professional life for my entire adult life. I am always really interested in what exists where. We get so many questions, and I just can't say enough to people about what Massachusetts has done, what the whole Northeast region up here has done. It's really incredible. So it's a testament to many of you in this room, and I'm really glad to be up here for this. So I want to share a little bit more than what Glenn shared about my story, because I think it informs what I want to share with you all tonight. As as Glenn said, substance-related death had certainly, and substance use in my family as something that had affected me, but a lot of people who are familiar with What's Your Grief know that grief was sort of part of my life from a really, really young age. My parents, when I was 4, I was very excited for my little brother Christopher, who was going to come home from the hospital, and unfortunately he was stillborn. And I marvel when I look back, because my parents didn't have the internet to go to navigate these questions of like, how do you support a toddler who you've gotten excited about their sibling who's coming home, and yet somehow my parents navigated it beautifully. I'm not sure how they did that, but it was really a testament to them. And then, you know, I feel like it's a laundry list. I won't go through all of it, but my best friend's mom died when I was 7, who had been like a second mom, and when I was 18, my dad died. And by the time my dad died, you know, I wasn't one of those people who was in that, like, why me, why us place, because loss had sort of been there all along. It had been this huge part of my life. And I did the things I thought you were supposed to do. I went to a therapist. I tried to go to a support group, and I hated it. And I gave up on all of it and was like, nope, none of this is for me. And kind of went about trying to figure out how to make sense of what life after loss looks like. A lot of people, I think, hear that much of my story and they're like, oh, of course you started What's Your Grief, of course you're a grief therapist, that makes sense. But if you had talked to me then, needless to say, I had no interest whatsoever in doing anything related to grief support. My sister was a few years younger than me, and one of the things that deeply affected my grief and just trying to make sense of the world after my dad died is within just, I don't even know, a year and a half, maybe, my sister had developed a really, really severe heroin addiction. And this was before the days of really talking about the opioid epidemic. It hadn't grown. No one had even heard the word fentanyl unless you worked in a hospital at that point. And for me, it absolutely shattered my entire world. After my dad died, I didn't really know that it could get worse, that it could get a lot worse, and that it could get a lot worse in these really different ways. And that's part of what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today as we talk about continuing connections, because at that time there was just so much I didn't understand. But one of the things that I absolutely understood was that in so many ways I was grieving. And I was grieving not just my dad, but I was grieving my sister and the person that she had been when she was sober. I was grieving her partner, who had come to be like a member of our family the moment that he walked through the door. So that's John, that is the two of us, the three of us, I should say. Me and the two of them in the UK, way back. And both of them in the midst of pretty low points in their addiction. And you know, when John came into our family's life, he and my sister met, and one of the things they connected about was that he'd been raised by a single mom, and his mom died when he was 15. And so there was this incredible connection in loss that was part of, I think, both their connection, but part of our family. Again, it just sort of felt like that continued. And at that point in my life, you know, grief was a word I associated with death. but certainly very quickly came to understand that we have this experience that I imagine many of you had in this room, where you realize that grief it's our natural and normal human response, not just to death, but to loss. And I think for so many of us, we, for many years, or at least if you were like me, didn't really know you had permission to use the word grief when it came to those years of living with an addiction and of living and loving people who have substance use disorders. When I finally went to graduate school and did all of the things that you do to go into mental health and work with people grieving, even if you hated therapy and counseling, you go back and you start to learn so much that you wish you had known, I think, in your own loss, in your own struggles. And one of the things that I learned and that I feel like I preach from the rooftops everywhere is understanding Colleen Voss and her incredible work talking about ambiguous grief, this idea that we can grieve people who are still alive, and when we're grieving them, we're not just grieving them, we're grieving ourselves, we're grieving the relationship we used to have, we're grieving the kind of mom that we could be to a sober child versus a child with an addiction, the kind of partner that we can be to a spouse who's sober versus a spouse who has an addiction. And that we're navigating that all the time, and that we're sort of losing little pieces of that person. And, as I know many of you know, going through that roller coaster of getting them back for a little while, and then watching them disappear again, and sort of trying to figure out what it means to grieve that. And that can start to define so much of our world. It can start to consume, I think, for us, when I look back, so much of my grief in the years following my dad's death was overshadowed by just that love of people with substance use disorders and how consuming it is trying to figure out how we can get them back, if we'll get them back, what we're doing that's wrong, how we can fix it. And that really overshadowed so much for me during those years. Unfortunately, as Glenn shared, sadly, John died of an overdose. And I think, you know, when that happened, all the complicated feelings came, right? All of the things that everyone in this room knows so well. All of the guilt, all of the self-blame, all of the judgment, all of the relief, and then the confusion about having feelings like relief. All the belief that somehow that was going to be my sister's wake-up call, right? Like, that's how it works somehow, right? Because so many people don't understand that the way it works isn't that you lose the love of your life and then that's what helps you to finally find sobriety, right? People struggle to understand that logic isn't there. So all of this happened, and that was really the first moment after John died that I finally felt like I was kind of able to grieve both my dad and John at the same time. There was finally kind of this space where I was able to go back to my dad's death, even as I was still trying to support my sister. And so I share all of this because at that moment, I started thinking so much about how we keep connections alive. And I have this one actually really specific kind of moment that I go back to where I was so aware of the fact that the way people were talking about John already, the way people were remembering John, the things people were tuned into, so much had to do with his addiction. It had to do with the things that they remembered about those last couple of years and how hard they had been. And it terrified me. You know, I had this moment of being so scared. And part of that was because at that moment, I still sort of understood grief as this thing that we were going to be getting over, right? That was what I thought we were still supposed to be working towards. I hadn't really understood anything other than the 5 stages of grief. And I had thought, okay, you know, even the counselor I had gone to had sort of made me feel like what I needed to do was sort of start working towards acceptance and working towards closure. And then I would be able to kind of move forward with my adult life, having resolved these issues. And I had the feeling that I imagine many of you have felt of like, no, I don't want closure. I don't want to put those people behind me. I don't want to leave that back there. And you know, again, you go to school, you learn about mental health, you learn about grief, and then you learn, wait, the 5 stages, that's not a thing, right? We don't subscribe to that anymore. As many of you probably already know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she created her 5 stages of grief, working with people who had terminal illnesses. So she observed them in people who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness from the time of their diagnosis until the time of their death, not with people who were grieving. But unsurprisingly, people loved her 5 stages because they sounded so neat and tidy and convenient, and they took this thing that is like so devastating and so complicated and packaged it up into something I think that we like, right? The idea of this narrative arc that we will somehow go through these 5 stages and there'll be the anger and the depression and the bargaining, but somehow we're going to get to this happy ending of acceptance. And so that caught on, right, like wildfire, and people started applying it to grief, even though that's not what she ever intended. And I wish I had known that when I was first grieving, that this was not something that I had to sign on for, this thing this therapist had told me that I needed to look for closure or acceptance. Because in so many ways, it was the thing that terrified me. I thought, if what we're doing is putting John in the past, we're putting him in the past as this person that people will remember as his addiction, that people will remember as just those most difficult moments and nothing else. And, you know, I think that still, right, so many things reinforce this, the internet, but what it did with grief was just this idea that what we're supposed to be doing is letting go and moving on and releasing, and, you know, you'd see these sort of messages everywhere. Thankfully, this is finally changing. Like, I'm so glad that what we're starting to see looks different than it did when I was going through a lot of the early periods of these losses. But I think when we look around at our friends, at our family members, as people who may not be paying attention to the narratives about mental health and grief, this idea is still pretty baked into our society and our culture. This idea that what we're supposed to be doing is finding closure and releasing and letting go. And so as grievers, I think we still find ourselves impacted by that. We still find ourselves maybe absorbing some of those messages from other people in our lives, or hearing things that they say to us that suggest maybe we're going on for too long, or that we've, shouldn't be continuing the connections the way that they are. Luckily, and I hope many of you probably, hopefully have heard some of these modern theories before, what made such an impact for me was when I started to understand that there were all these people out there talking about all of these different ways that we grieve. I won't bore you with grief theory, even though I love to bore people with grief theory. But the dual process model of grief came around in the 1990s, and these were people who were saying, you know, it does not look like grief has this end point that these stages and phases and task models have been leading us to believe. It seems like what we do is we are always bouncing back and forth after loss forever between doing these things that are loss-oriented, these grief-related things, and then also trying to rebuild our lives, and that we don't come to some sort of end point when this happens. We just continue to bounce back and forth. We get a little better at each side. We learn how to carry the weight of it. But that is the work that we're doing in this ongoing way as people living life after loss. And I finally was able to really lean into this idea that it's not just me wanting to not find closure, but that mental health has actually made this shift and said, you know, it's okay that we're going to grieve in some way forever. And for a long time, I always tried to figure out how to draw a visual of it, and this is my visual of how my grief has evolved over the years, right? That in those early days, we struggled to even imagine what it means to grieve forever. That actually feels terrifying because the earliest days of acute grief are so painful. They are that moment when our entire world has been completely shattered and we cannot imagine that there is any way that we will ever want to live in that world, much less be able to figure out how to live in that world. And then somehow, everybody made it to this room, right? Everybody put one foot in front of the other and took one breath at a time, and somehow you start to be able to see something that you couldn't see the day before. And I think part of what allows us to put one foot in front of the other, to do those things, to make it to the next day, is what in the 1990s they coined continuing bonds theory, right? This was this huge paradigm shift in grief support that happened in the 1990s, where three researchers and clinicians who worked in the field, they all got together, and in their conversations, they were like, all this rhetoric for all of the last century, going back to Freud, was telling people that they needed to put their memories of their loved ones in the past. And they needed to do that in order to find the energy to reinvest in their life going forward. And these continuing bonds theorists said, we're working with all these people out here. Some of them were working with Compassionate Friends groups. Some of them were working with widows, some were working with college students who had been bereaved as children. And what they found was that all of them were trying to find ways to continue connections with the person who died. And they were like, these people don't look unhealthy, they don't look pathological, it doesn't look like it's a problem that they haven't found closure or acceptance. It actually looks like these connections are the thing that are helping them to get to tomorrow. The idea that they can bring their loved one with them into the future is the thing that makes it worth trying to fight to get to the future. And if we have to tell people that what they should be working towards is letting go, that's not going to inspire people to try to come to grief support, to show up, right? It certainly didn't help me to come to grief support when someone told me that. And so I think we have this shift that is so important to what allows all of us us to be able to live in the world without the people who we don't have. It's this permission, right? That we can do this with the confidence that it's not crazy, it's not abnormal, we're not losing it, we're doing something that happens normally and naturally for so many people. The big fear though, the one that I have over many years felt personally, I've seen in my own family, I've seen with working with so many people in grief, specifically who are grieving substance-related deaths, is this fear that our connection to the way the person died, or those years of that devastating substance use disorder, have left such a devastating imprint that our bond is going to somehow be defined by that, or overshadowed by that. Or, on the other side of this, we have this incredible passion that sometimes comes because of their addiction, because of their substance use disorder, to say, I want to do something about this epidemic. I want to do advocacy work. I want to fight for this. I want to help other people who are grieving substance-related deaths. And that can be so meaningful and so important and such a huge part of healing for some people, not for everybody, for some people. But what that sometimes does is keeps us in the place where we're connected and so often thinking about and talking about that substance use disorder, thinking about and talking about that addiction, which was part of their lives. It was part of who they were. It's something that we should talk about, right? But it wasn't the only thing about their lives. And so sometimes we find ourselves struggling to strike that balance, right? How do we cope with that after a substance-related death? How does that change our continued bond? What does it look like? And sometimes we have to make a little bit of extra effort. We have to do things that look a little bit different in how we think about our continued bonds than I did when it was my dad's death, or in other losses that you may have had where there wasn't as many complications as the complications that come with addictions and the memories that come with those addictions and all of those things that we carry with us. So, continuing bonds, as we think about what does this mean, right? What do we do as we think about how we create continued connections? You know, I think the first thing to remember is we saw all these groups, all these researchers, what they observed was people were just sort of naturally doing this. It was a little bit different for everybody, but it was happening for young, old, it didn't matter, the relationship to the person who died, you know, for the most part, this was something that was just naturally emerging. And so, in some ways, it was both, like grief, sort of universal and unique. It was something that most people were doing, and yet the ways they were doing it looked really different for everyone. I think part of that is because sometimes we forget that none of us are really grieving the same loss. You know, even if we've lost the same person, our relationship with that person was completely unique. The way we interacted, what we loved the most about them, the memories that we have with them, those things are something that is special to us and that particular person. It can look so different, even for people in the same family, even for people who are grieving the same type of loss. We know that it looks different for all of us. And we know that we all grieve differently. And so this is one of the things that can be a challenge as we look at how do we continue our connection as a family? How do we continue our connections when some of us may be more of those intuitive style grievers, right? Intuitive grievers are those of us who really like to process our emotions, to talk about how we're feeling. We oftentimes have our internal states, they come out on the outside, right? So how we're feeling emotionally inside, you might see them through the tears or the other things that come out. And then we have our instrumental grievers, right? Instrumental grievers tend to be folks who they are a little bit more cognitive. Their grief comes more in thoughts than it does in emotions. They often don't value talking as much, and the research shows that they don't actually get as much benefit from talking. So it's not just they're avoiding, it's not just that they're like repressing, it's that that's just not how they grieve. They often tend to be a little more active in their grief too. They like to do things, there's more physicality in their grief. And those are just two of the differences. There's so many other differences. Some people really, really want to create those memorial shrines so that they every day can see the person who died. And other people are like, no, I'm good. I like to find my own specific time and place, and I do that not every time I walk in the door. I don't always want it to be there. And again, these are both normal, but it's one of the big challenges. When we layer substance-related deaths on there, it can be even more complicated because we know that the relationship in life with each person may have looked even more different and even more complicated. So we see it all get intensified, right? That we're all grieving differently. And we're all, as a result, healing differently. Part of what we are often doing is trying to make sense of what is going to help us. When I first lost my dad and then was in those years of the worst of addiction with my sister and John, I really only knew about counseling and support groups. Like, that was the only thing I thought that people did for grief support. And when it didn't work for me, I was terrified. I was like, okay, I guess that means I'm out here on my own, trying to figure out what to do. But slowly, as I imagine has happened with many of you, as you have come together in connection with other people, you start talking to people and you realize people are doing like all sorts of stuff to cope with their grief. People are processing in so many different ways. People are keeping connections in ways I never could have thought of. Next Friday, I have tickets to a woman who is doing a grief burlesque show in memory of her husband. It's unbelievable, right? The things that people do. And when I talked to her about this, right, she gave me the laundry list of other things that she had done before that. And she said, this is the thing that has made me feel closest to him, because this is the thing that he would be the most excited about. And, I think that part of coming together with other people, part of these connections and conversations we have about how we grieve, and knowing that there are no rules, there's no stages, we all do it differently, we don't have to talk about it, then we can start listening to each other, and we can start seeing and hearing all these creative ways, all these unusual, quirky things that sometimes we think we're the only one who does it, and so we don't tell anybody about it because we think it's kind of crazy or they'll judge us. As we find spaces where we can get more comfortable, we start to see how wide open the world is for creating ways to cope with our grief and ways to keep all sorts of connections with the person who died. There's this wonderful research from Norton and Gino from Harvard that they did, when was it, 2014. And they are really transparent in how they went into this research. They were going to do research around ritual in grief. And they went in with a hypothesis that they wanted to test. And what they believed was, when they did their research, they thought that they were going to find that public communal rituals were vital to people grieving, that this is something that they believed went back across history, and that their research was going to really show just how important this was to our society, and that we needed to sort of talk about these things. And what they found was actually radically different. They found that the rituals that were the most meaningful to people in their grief and in keeping their connection and in comforting themselves were private, secular, and individual rituals. They were the little things that people did that often reflected the unique connection that they had with their loved ones. Now, I don't think this means that people don't want community. I don't think this means people don't want public ritual. I think what this reflects is that people want something that's ongoing, right? We can have an incredible funeral, but we can't do it every day. We can't do it every week. We probably can't even do it every year and still get the same turnout, right? But these things, we can control. We can do them every day. And that's exactly what Norton and Gino suspected too. And so they did more research. And that's really what they found. They found that what people wanted was a way to feel confident that their loved one would be remembered in the world. Not knowing if somebody's going to show up next year to the funeral memorial that you're having 15th year in a row, but knowing that these are little things that we can do every single day that are part of our connection to the people who we've lost. And with this, with these bonds, with these rituals, with these continued bonds, one of the things that the research has shown, and I think if your loss was years ago, you've probably seen in yourself, is that these bonds continue to change over time. These rituals change over time. What meant so much 6 months after the loss might not mean so much 6 years later. But other things might mean so much 6 years later that you never could have even imagined 6 months after the loss would have been important. And part of that is because our relationships evolve and change. They evolve and change in life, and they evolve and change in death. And I think for me, when I look at all these things that I've sort of learned as a professional and then learned working with tens of thousands of grievers over the years and hearing from so many people, that I really wish someone had said to me back, when I was 18 years old and my dad died, is that so much of grief is about learning to have that relationship with the dead. It's about what does it mean to have that relationship, and what does it mean to be open to letting it evolve and letting it grow. When my dad died and when John died, I thought, in part because of what those counselors told me, that all I had left was the memories of them that were in the past. I sort of thought about it like a box, right? I had these memories, these times with them, and I would be able to go back, and I would be able to open the box and look in there and look at my memories and maybe spend some time with them sometimes, but I would never be able to put anything new in that box. Like that was it, it was done. And what I've learned over time is that box is not closed, right? We are adding things to it all the time. I walk out into the world and I see things all the time where I think, oh my gosh, my dad would have loved this. John would have loved this. This is a picture of a concert at the Gorge, which is a music venue out in Washington State, an incredible outdoor music venue. And I remember, it was not long at all after John died that I went to visit friends in Seattle, and they took me there. And the moment that I got there, I was just like, oh my God, John would have loved this place so much. And I called my sister and I was like, I wish you could see where I am right now. John would have loved this. And I had another similar experience around that time. My dad had been a big beer drinker. He died before the craft beer movement really happened. And I walked into a grocery store that had all these craft beers, and I thought, like, wow, my dad really would have loved this. And I thought, these moments, right, these ways that I experience new things in the world, and I think of them, I think of how they shaped the way I see those things, made me so aware of the way we're always adding to the box, right? We're always allowing our relationship to continue to evolve and to continue to grow. With that, sometimes that's in wonderful ways and sometimes that's in difficult ways, right? It isn't all wonderful. We see so many moments in the world, so many triggers or things that activate things that remind us of the hardest imprints that they left on us, especially when we're maybe connecting with other people who are dealing with substance-related deaths, or when we're doing advocacy work, or if we work at all in recovery in other areas. We have every single day moments where we're reminded of the wonderful imprints that we might want to affirm, and then we're reminded of other ones which we find harder, some of them that we may feel like we want to relinquish. And part of grief, right, part of this work of creating continued connections is knowing that we're sort of active participants in our own grief. We get to make decisions about those things that we want to put into the world, that we want to connect with, that we want to remember. And then we get to do healing around the things that we want to relinquish or we want to forgive in ourselves and them, the things that we maybe need to have a lot of compassion and self-compassion around. And that means that we have to talk about all the complicated stuff, right? It means that we get comfortable and surround ourselves with other people and connect with other people who allow us to be able to share all of the best and all of the most complicated, because we have to share all of that if we're going to be able to figure out how we heal from it. So, part of what I kind of want to leave everyone with tonight as you go into the rest of the weekend is thinking about different ways that we connect to the people that we've lost. And all of these are things that have come to me through other people in grief in some way, who have shared how they were parts of thinking about ongoing connections. One is the concept of an ethical will. Is anybody familiar with this already, an ethical will? So this is a concept that I learned about from Lisa Schulman. She's a neurologist, and her husband was a neurologist. She wrote a book called Before and After about her husband's death and her grief, and as a neurologist trying to make sense why she felt like she was going crazy and why she felt like as a neurologist she couldn't understand what was happening. But she's the one who introduced me to this. She's also from Baltimore. And it's a traditional Jewish practice that often happens before a death, where, as it says on here, someone articulates their strongly held values as elements of the legacy that they want to leave, what they hope they've left behind, that are not physical objects, but other things that they have hopefully left in the world to their family members. but it's something that many people have adopted doing, not just as the person who is dying, but sometimes as the family surrounding them, sharing with the person who's dying the things that they have imparted that will be left in the world, the values that they have, the things that those people will always remember and want to affirm. And from that, many people have adopted doing this after a death, right? Because many of us didn't have the chance with our loved ones to be able to think about things like this. But we can think about it now. We can think about if they had been able to leave an ethical will, what would they have told us that they wanted? What were their values that they wanted left in the world? What were the things about the way they lived and the things that you knew, not just from one moment of their life, but looking over their entire lives, right? Of the things that are part of our connection, that may be part of the way that we continue to carry out their legacy in the world. One of the others is from Joseph Casper, and this came to me indirectly through Lucy Hone, who is a really incredible woman whose daughter died, and she knew Joseph Casper through a program that they went to together. And he's a physician, and his son died. And he ended up sort of struggling through trying to figure out how to live after his son's death. He decided to go and do a degree in positive psychology at University of Pennsylvania with Martin Seligman. And he really started trying to investigate what was helping him, what was getting him through the day, what was helping him to survive his son's death. And he coined this term, co-destiny. And he says here, this is quoting him, "Co-destiny is the idea that if you do good in a person's name, it adds to that person's legacy. The awareness that I could add goodness to my son's life by doing good in his name motivates me to this day. Everything I do that is a result of having known and raised my son ultimately reflects back on him, adding to my perceived quality of his life. This motivates me not only to change my philosophy in life, but to act upon this philosophy." Eleanor, who I run What's Your Grief with, she says that learning about this changed the way she thought of things from in spite of to because of. And she's like, this is something that has allowed me to have moments where I say, I do this because of them. Had it not been for them, this wouldn't exist in the world. And that's part of how their legacy continues to ripple through the world in the things that we do. And the last piece is related to the little cards that you have on your table. And this came from a conversation that I had with a woman, and I'm sure some of you have been in this place where you're looking at someone who is maybe in exactly the spot that you were 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 5 years ago, and you see that pain, and you remember exactly how excruciating it was. And as we were talking, she expressed that fear that I mentioned earlier. It was this fear that her best friend would only be remembered for his addiction, that people would forget the memories that there had been so many years before within their friend group of wonderful trips and things that had been absolutely incredible, but that she felt like they were overshadowed by these last few years. And as we were talking, she said, I just wish people knew that he was a million other things. He wasn't just this addiction, he was a million other things. And after she said it, I kept coming back to it, and I was like, right, that's it. We we want to be able to remember them for everything. And the addiction was part of it. The substance use was part of it. It's not ignoring that. It's not sugarcoating that. It's not doing advocacy or memorial work around that. It's doing that and remembering the million other things. So we started a project on What's Your Grief, where people could submit their memory of their million other things. And it is something that we invite you all to do this evening. On your tables, there are little cards, and the cards just have, little circles where you can write things, anything you want. But I encourage you to think about, the values that were there, what they would say in their ethical wills, anything. It could be their favorite foods, right? The things that live on. It could be that you're a good tipper because they were a good tipper. But as we remember these million other things, to think about, it's not just things that we remember about them, right? It's things that we can both remember and that we can live out in our own lives that extends their legacy, that becomes part of that co-destiny. So with that, I could have at this point talked for 15 minutes or an hour, I have no idea, but I'm gonna invite everybody to go to their tables and just spend some time with the cards, but also encourage people to chat with each other and, spend a few minutes sharing whatever you decide to write on your cards. And I think we do have space where people can display.
Yep, we've got a board in the back, so you can bring it and we can hang it up on the board.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you all so much. If anyone has questions or wants to talk more about anything, I'm happy to answer and chat.
Excuse me, what did Robin just say about what we can do with the cards? I didn't hear her.
I think Robin said that you can post the cards up on the board.
Right where Robin is back there.
Mm-hmm.